The Galactic Council convened in the vast council chamber, an enormous circular room where representatives from hundreds of species gathered to discuss matters that affected the galaxy. The chamber was lit by a soft glow from the energy fields lining the ceiling, and the air hummed with a constant murmur of languages and the shifting of alien beings. In the center, a large translucent table shimmered with holographic displays, showcasing reports from across the galaxy. Despite the usual harmony that filled these meetings, today was different. The atmosphere was heavy, leaden with tension. At the far end of the room, the Orcs, an ancient species known for their immense knowledge and longevity, stood silent, their presence commanding respect from all corners of the galaxy. Their skin was almost translucent, and their eyes glowed with the light of countless stars they had witnessed over millennia. A figure rose from the Orcs delegation, an elder with furrowed skin and weary eyes. His voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of concern. Elder Thraxi, the leader of the Orcs, took a deep breath before speaking. His words echoed in the chamber, drawing the attention of every representative present. The humans, they are a danger. Elder Thraxi began, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. I do not speak of their technology, nor their expansion, though these are troubling. No, I speak of something far more dangerous. They are unpredictable, uncontrollable. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Some species, like the Vothar, known for their cold, calculating logic, exchanged brief glances. Others, such as the Thalrak, who prided themselves on their strength and ancient pride, scoffed inwardly. What can they truly do? Murmured one Thalrak representative, his voice low but dismissive. They are still so young, fragile. Elder Thraxi's piercing gaze fell upon him. You underestimate them. That will be your downfall. The humans are different. The chamber fell silent. There was a slight rustle in the air as the Zarvan, a species of merchants and diplomats, leaned forward, clearly intrigued. The Zarvan had an uncanny ability to assess and predict power structures, and even they sensed something ominous in Thraxi's words. What do you mean? Came a voice, one of the Tyrith, a species of keenly intelligent beings who had lived for millennia but lacked the physical prowess to challenge the dominant powers of the galaxy. Thraxi paused, as though weighing how much to reveal. They are not like any species we have encountered before. When they fight, it is not with brute strength or superior weaponry. They fight with a relentless drive, an unyielding will. Their minds are quick, adaptable. They can rise from the ashes of defeat in ways we cannot predict. He turned to face the rest of the council, his voice growing quieter, but no less intense. And more than that, they have something none of us understand, a kind of unity. They fight for each other, for their survival. This is not like the wars we have waged or the disputes we have settled. This is something different. A murmur spread across the room. General Korath, a leader among the Thalrak, leaned back in his chair, his arms folded. So you claim that the humans could challenge us all? Thraxi nodded solemnly. Not only challenge. They could dismantle everything we have built. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The words hung in the air like a weight, and the council members exchanged uneasy glances. The older species, those who had seen countless civilizations rise and fall, were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. One by one, they realized that Elder Thraxi's warning was not merely a concern, it was a prophecy of what was to come. And though they would never admit it aloud, each of them secretly feared the same thing. Humanity had arrived, and the consequences of provoking them would be far more severe than anyone could have imagined. The first whispers of humanity's potential had begun long before their official entrance into galactic affairs. Earth, a small isolated planet, was far from the center of the galaxy's power. Yet it was there, on that blue and green orb, that humanity had begun to forge a destiny unlike any other species. Humanity's first major step into space began only a few centuries ago, when their primitive technologies had somehow propelled them into the stars. The initial efforts were modest, barely able to navigate the space between their neighboring planets. But what humanity lacked in sheer power, they more than made up for with creativity, resilience, and an unshakable will to survive. These traits, seen by the ancient species as mere quirks, would soon prove to be humanity's greatest weapons. It wasn't long before humanity's curious nature drove them to encounter the first hostile species beyond their home system, the Hexorax. A brutal and expansionist species, the Hexorax were notorious for their habit of enslaving other civilizations, subjugating weaker species with overwhelming force. When they first discovered humans, they thought nothing of them. The Hexorax had dealt with countless other species before, crushing them underfoot. But humanity's response would be anything but predictable. The attack came swiftly, as it often did with the Hexorax. A human colony, nestled on a newly claimed world, became the target of a sudden invasion. The Hexorax fleet descended from the stars, armed with devastating weaponry and overwhelming numbers. It seemed like a simple matter for the Hexorax to wipe the humans off the face of their colony. But the humans didn't surrender. Instead, they adapted, quickly and brutally. They had no fleet of their own, no vast army at their disposal. What they did have was an unyielding will to protect their families, their way of life. The Hexorax underestimated this primal instinct. What followed was a vicious, guerrilla-style conflict that would soon become legend. Human forces, small in number but fierce in spirit, retreated into the harsh terrain of their planet. They utilized the planet's natural features, dense forests, cave systems, and steep mountain ranges, as perfect hideouts. They constructed crude but effective traps, sabotaged enemy supply lines, and fought in ways that no species had ever anticipated. Their attacks weren't always direct, but they were precise. Each strike calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum resources. In the midst of this unexpected resistance, the Hexorax learned a bitter lesson. Humans were not just survivors, they were problem solvers. Where the Hexorax relied on brute strength and numbers, the humans relied on ingenuity and resourcefulness. The Hexorax fleet, overconfident and unwieldy, found itself outmaneuvered at every turn. Soon, they began to lose ships, large, advanced ships, each one taken down by traps or clever human tactics. It became clear that no matter how powerful they were, the Hexorax could not crush humanity as easily as they had done with other species. What shocked the Hexorax even more was the humans' ability to rebuild. After each attack, the humans would regroup, innovate, and find new ways to fight. They would not give up. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more the Hexorax grew concerned. Their fleet was stretched thin, and they were unable to subdue the human resistance. Eventually, the Hexorax withdrew, defeated, not by superior weapons or force, but by the very thing they had failed to understand about humanity. The humans would never stop fighting. The Orcs, watching this unfold from a distance, began to grasp the terrifying truth. Humans were not just another species to be studied or categorized. They were something entirely new. Their will, their creativity, and their relentless spirit were forces that no species could predict or contain. As the Thorax retreated, the human survivors sent a message to the galactic community. We are not like you. It was a warning. Though none of the other species understood it yet, the Orcs did. They had seen civilizations rise and fall, but never one quite like humanity. And now they knew the galaxy would have to change, because humans were coming. And when they arrived, the rules of the game would be rewritten. The aftermath of humanity's victory over the Thorax sent shockwaves through the galaxy. No one had anticipated that a species so young, so seemingly fragile, could stand up to such a powerful foe. Yet there it was, a clear message that humanity could no longer be dismissed as an insignificant species on the fringe of galactic affairs. The Orcs were not the only ones who had taken notice. The Thalrak, one of the oldest and most influential species in the galaxy, were paying close attention as well. The Thalrak had always prided themselves on their wisdom and their ancient legacy. They believed themselves to be the moral and intellectual leaders of the galaxy. Their history was rich, their influence widespread, and their strength undeniable. But they had never encountered a species like humanity, one whose drive and unpredictability threatened to disrupt the balance they had worked so hard to maintain. It began with an incident that no one had predicted, a diplomatic summit on a neutral moon, where ambassadors from various species gathered to discuss the future of galactic trade and peacekeeping. Among the attendees was a human representative, Ambassador Soren Keel, a young but sharp negotiator who had quickly risen through the ranks due to his ability to think on his feet. He was not the typical diplomat. His background as a former soldier gave him a unique perspective, one that had earned him both admiration and wariness from the other representatives. During the summit, tensions ran high. The Thalrak, feeling their position as the intellectual and political leaders of the galaxy threatened by humanity's rise, saw an opportunity to assert their dominance. Ambassador Athish, the Thalrak leader, was a figurehead of great influence, his presence commanding respect. He was known for his sharp tongue and unyielding demeanor, and he had little patience for what he saw as the overzealous presence of the humans in galactic affairs. As the negotiations dragged on, Athish grew increasingly agitated by Soren Keel's questions and suggestions. The human ambassador was not backing down from his stance on certain key issues, challenging long-standing policies that favored the established species. Athish, irritated and perhaps sensing a threat to his authority, made a mistake, one that would prove to be disastrous. In a moment of uncharacteristic arrogance, Athish publicly humiliated Ambassador Keel, belittling him and suggesting that humans were incapable of understanding the complexities of galactic diplomacy. He mocked Keel's species for their history of violence and their primitive ways, believing that a show of superiority would put the humans in their place. The room fell silent. Ambassador Keel, though visibly shaken, did not flinch. The other representatives watched, unsure of how the human would react. What happened next was not what anyone expected. Keel, instead of responding with anger or retreat, calmly accessed the summit's data terminals and projected a series of images for all to see. The images were a carefully compiled dossier of Athish's own political dealings, corruption, exploitation of other species, and a history of underhanded deals that had enriched his family at the expense of countless lives. The evidence was irrefutable. As the images flashed across the room, a stunned silence enveloped the chamber. Athish's arrogance turned to fear as his own species began to question his leadership. The Thalrak had always seen themselves as the wise arbiters of the galaxy, but now they were exposed for their own moral failings. Keel had not attacked them with weapons or brute force. He had simply used their own secrets against them, laying bare the truth that even the mighty Thalrak could not ignore. In that moment, humanity's reputation shifted. The galaxy was no longer just worried about human violence or their unpredictable nature. Now, there was something else at play. Humanity had proven that they could wield something more powerful than a weapon. They had the ability to unmask and expose the darkest secrets of the galaxy's most powerful leaders. The Thalrak, deeply embarrassed and furious, demanded a formal apology. But the damage had been done. Athish's once unshakable power was shattered, and the reputation of humanity, once considered unpredictable and brash, had solidified into something far more dangerous, a species willing to fight for their place, even if it meant exposing the undercurrents of corruption that ran through the galaxy's leadership. The Orcs, having witnessed the events unfold from a distance, understood the implications. Humanity was no longer just a threat in terms of military might. They were now a force that could alter the very fabric of galactic politics, exposing the cracks in the foundation of long-established powers. The warning had become clear. underestimate humanity at your peril. The galaxy was changing, slowly but surely, and humanity was at the heart of that change. What had begun as a modest effort to survive had transformed into a powerful wave of rebellion, innovation, and unity. The galaxy's ancient species, who had long dominated the political landscape, now found themselves struggling to maintain control. The moment of reckoning came when the Scyra, an ancient species known for their militaristic nature, set their sights on a small human colony located on the resource-rich planet of Viridia IV. The Scyra had been a dominant force for millennia, their legions of soldiers and advanced war machines feared throughout the galaxy. They believed that they could expand their empire by seizing planets from weaker species, and they saw humanity as just another obstacle to overcome. Viridia IV was a vital resource hub for the human coalition, a growing alliance of human-controlled worlds that had begun to flex their collective muscle in the galaxy. The Scyra, convinced that the humans would fold in the face of overwhelming force, launched a brutal invasion of the colony. They descended from the sky in waves of warships, dropping thousands of soldiers onto the surface in a swift, almost effortless strike. But the Scyra miscalculated. The humans were not unprepared, and they had no intention of surrendering without a fight. Underestimating the humans' ability to adapt and fight back, the Scyra made their first mistake. They underestimated human resolve. What they didn't know was that Viridia IV was not just any colony. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, a hub of resourcefulness and innovation. The humans living there had long been prepared for an eventual conflict, knowing that the Scyra might one day come to claim it. When the Scyra forces landed, they were greeted not by the docile, unarmed colonists they expected, but by a well-organized and heavily fortified resistance. The humans had turned their home into a fortress, using the planet's natural terrain to their advantage. Vast swamps, thick jungles, and towering mountain ranges became the perfect environment for guerrilla warfare. The Scyra, known for their grand, strategic assaults, quickly found themselves in an unfamiliar situation. They were being outflanked, outsmarted, and harassed at every turn. Human fighters, though outnumbered, attacked with a precision and savagery that stunned the Scyra. They used homemade explosives to disable Scyra war machines, ambushed supply convoys, and sabotaged key infrastructure. The Scyra, reliant on their overwhelming numbers and strength, could not keep up with the lightning-fast strikes that crippled their forces. The humans' ingenuity was proving to be a weapon in itself, one that the Scyra could not counter. As the weeks passed, the Scyra found themselves bogged down in a long and costly conflict. Their advanced weaponry and massive warships were no match for the human tactics. The humans didn't engage in conventional battles. Instead, they fought with the environment, using it to conceal their movements and manipulate the battlefield. Where the Scyra preferred to meet their enemies head-on, the humans adapted, turning each engagement into a chaotic, unpredictable fight. The Scyra began to lose ground, and their once unshakable confidence began to crumble. But it wasn't just the humans' military prowess that was shaking the Scyra. It was their ability to inspire. The human resistance was not just a force of soldiers, it was a movement. Civilians, scientists, and workers from across the human colonies had come together to fight. What began as a local defense turned into a symbol of unity for the human coalition. Across the galaxy, the news spread. The humans were standing against the might of the Scyra and winning. The Scyra, desperate to turn the tide, unleashed their full force on Viridia IV. But it was too late. The tide had already turned. The humans, emboldened by their success, launched a devastating counterattack that crippled the Scyra's command structure. With key leaders and military assets taken out in a series of coordinated strikes, the Scyra had no choice but to retreat, leaving the colony in the hands of its determined defenders. The victory was a turning point. The human-led resistance on Viridia IV was not just a tactical win, it was a statement. The Scyra, once thought to be an unstoppable force, had been bested by human ingenuity and unity. It sent ripples throughout the galaxy, igniting a spark that would not be easily extinguished. The Orcs, watching from their distant observatories, began to realize the full scope of the threat humanity posed. The Sierra had been beaten by their own pride and underestimation, and humanity had proven that they could survive in the harshest conditions, adapt to any environment, and most terrifying of all, unite when necessary. The galaxy was on the brink of a new era, one in which humanity was no longer a mere observer, but a central player. And as the galaxy's ancient powers tried to regain control, they could no longer ignore the unstoppable force humanity had become. The news of humanity's victory over the Sierra spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The ancient species that once held dominion over vast swathes of space now found themselves questioning their place in the cosmos. The Sierra, once considered one of the most formidable militaristic forces in the galaxy, had been humbled. But it wasn't just the Sierra's loss that had reverberated throughout the stars. It was the realization that humanity, a species once regarded as primitive and fragile, had shattered all expectations. In the wake of their victory, humanity's position in galactic politics shifted. The Human Coalition, a collection of human-controlled worlds, grew in power and influence, now a force to be reckoned with. They were no longer a scattered collection of isolated colonies. They had become a unified and formidable entity. The leaders of the coalition, including Ambassador Soren Keel, began to push for greater representation in the Galactic Council, the very body that had once looked down on them. But this rapid rise was not without its challenges. The Zarvan, a shrewd and calculating species of diplomats and traders, immediately began working behind the scenes to undermine humanity's influence. The Zarvan had always been experts in power dynamics, and they knew that humanity's newfound prominence could upset the delicate balance they had worked so hard to maintain. They began spreading rumors about human instability, calling them reckless, unpredictable, and dangerous. Meanwhile, the Thalrak, deeply shaken by the exposure of their own corruption at the summit with Ambassador Keel, were not about to let humanity's growing influence go unchallenged. Their leaders, still reeling from the loss of their political stronghold, saw the human rise as a direct threat to their own legacy. They began to rally their allies, forming a coalition to oppose any further expansion of human power. The Thalrak were wise, but they were also proud and stubborn. Their resistance to humanity was born not out of fear, but from their refusal to acknowledge a species they saw as inferior rising above them. And then there were the Orcs, whose ancient wisdom gave them a unique perspective on the unfolding events. They were the first to recognize the danger humanity posed, not just as a military power, but as a force capable of reshaping the entire galaxy. Their warnings, once dismissed as the ramblings of an overzealous elder, now carried weight. However, the Orcs were careful, understanding that direct intervention could provoke a larger conflict. Instead, they chose to observe, hoping to gain a deeper understanding of humanity's true potential. They knew that this was no longer a matter of simple diplomacy or trade. It was a matter of survival. Humanity, for their part, had already begun to brace for the inevitable political struggles ahead. Ambassador Keel, ever the strategist, had begun forging alliances with the smaller, more neutral species that had long been marginalized in galactic affairs. These species, seeing the growing tension, were eager for a new power structure, one in which they could have a say. Keel's deft diplomacy helped to consolidate a strong bloc of allies, ensuring that humanity's voice could not be easily silenced. But the true test came when the Galactic Council convened for its next major summit. The question on everyone's mind was not whether humanity would be given a seat at the table, but how far they would push to reshape the galaxy's political landscape. The Sierra, their pride wounded, had already withdrawn from the proceedings, choosing instead to retreat into their territories. The Thalrak and the Zarvan, on the other hand, were eager to challenge humanity's rising influence at every turn. The summit began with the usual speeches, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of tension in the air. The Orcs, seated at the head of the chamber, observed the proceedings with a quiet intensity. They knew that the galaxy was on the precipice of something monumental, and the next few decisions would determine whether humanity's rise would be met with cooperation or conflict. Ambassador Keel took to the stage, his voice calm but unwavering. He spoke not just of humanity's need for recognition, but of their desire to ensure a more balanced and fair galaxy, one where the larger powers no longer dictated the fate of the smaller ones. He called for a new era of cooperation, where all species, regardless of age or power, could work together to maintain peace and prosperity. As his words echoed in the chamber, the representatives of the galaxy listened, some intrigued, others fearful. But one thing was certain: humanity had set a new course for the future. The galaxy, for better or worse, would never be the same again. The tensions that simmered in the Galactic Council chamber following Ambassador Keel's speech were only the beginning. Though humanity had made their case for a new order, one where cooperation replaced domination, the path forward was far from certain. There were those who viewed this new order as a welcome change, while others saw it as an existential threat to the established balance of power. The ancient species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia had not risen to their positions through diplomacy alone. They had the strength, the resources, and, most importantly, the willingness to fight for their place at the top. While the public debates continued, the real maneuvering began behind closed doors. The Zarvan, ever the master of subtlety, had already begun crafting a campaign to discredit humanity's claims to leadership. They leveraged their extensive networks to influence smaller species, sowing seeds of doubt about the human intention to maintain peace. If humans are allowed too much power, they will not stop, they whispered in the shadows. Their hunger for control will destabilize everything. The Thalrak, still nursing their wounds from their confrontation with humanity, saw a different danger. Their pride was bruised, but they also recognized that the growing human coalition threatened to replace them as the moral authority of the galaxy. The Thalrak had always prided themselves on their intellectual and cultural superiority, and to have a young species rise so quickly was more than a slight. It was a challenge to everything they believed. They began to quietly rally their allies, carefully assembling a coalition to push back against humanity's influence. The Thalrak were not interested in war, not yet, but they were willing to use every resource at their disposal to check humanity's growth before it became uncontrollable. Yet, as powerful as the Zarvan and Thalrak were, it was the Syra who posed the most immediate threat. Though they had been defeated on Viridia IV, their loss was a humiliating blow that they would not accept lightly. The Syra were not a species known for their subtlety or diplomacy. They were warriors driven by the desire for conquest and dominance. Their defeat at the hands of the humans had stung deeply, and they were determined to reclaim their pride and power. Though the Syra had withdrawn from the Galactic Summit, they had not forgotten humanity's role in their fall. In the weeks that followed, the Syra began to prepare in secret. They used their extensive networks to find sympathetic factions among the smaller species, those who had been dissatisfied with the recent changes in the power structure. The Syra knew that they could not challenge the human coalition directly, not yet, but they had other methods at their disposal. They began to fund rebel groups and rogue factions, sowing chaos across human-controlled worlds. The Syra's hope was simple: if they could destabilize humanity's position in the galaxy, it would be far easier to take back what they had lost. But humanity, for all its flaws and unpredictability, was not unaware of the growing threats around them. The human coalition had already begun to take steps to bolster their defenses. Ambassador Keel, aware of the covert actions being taken against them, began working with his allies to ensure that they were not caught off guard. The human military, once fragmented and weak, had undergone a rapid transformation. New fleets were being constructed, and new alliances were being formed, all in the name of safeguarding humanity's place in the galaxy. The Orcs, ever watchful, saw the signs of what was coming. They had never been a species to interfere directly in galactic affairs, but they could not remain silent in the face of the brewing storm. Elder Thraxi, once the lone voice of warning, now convened with his fellow Orcs. They were torn. The balance of the galaxy was in jeopardy, but they knew that directly intervening could escalate the conflict beyond control. Their wisdom told them that the galaxy was at a crossroads, but they could not offer a solution without risking the wrath of both the established powers and the newly rising humans. And so, the galaxy stood at the edge of an uncertain future. Humanity, with its unrelenting drive and ingenuity, had become a force that could no longer be ignored. But as the other species maneuvered behind the scenes, preparing for either conflict or submission, it became clear that the true test for humanity was not just whether they could stand up to the galaxy's established powers, but whether they could unite under the pressure of the forces arrayed against them. The battle for the future of the galaxy was no longer just political, it was becoming personal. And humanity's response to the quiet threats now brewing would determine whether they would rise to the occasion or be crushed under the weight of the galaxy's ancient powers. As the weeks passed, the tension in the galaxy grew thicker. The quiet moves made by the Zarvan, Falrak, and Sira had not gone unnoticed by the human coalition. Ambassador Keel, who had once been viewed as a diplomatic upstart, now found himself at the center of a storm far larger than anything he had anticipated. The galaxy was on the verge of a new kind of war, not one of armies clashing in the void, but a war of information, subterfuge, and alliances. The Zarvan, with their diplomatic cunning, had begun to spread rumors throughout the galactic community, painting the human coalition as an unpredictable, power-hungry force that threatened the stability of the galaxy. They whispered that humanity, despite its peaceful rhetoric, was secretly preparing for a conquest of its own. The Zarvan knew that their subtlety would be the key to undermining the humans, and so they took every opportunity to spread doubt. Meanwhile, the Falrak were working from a different angle. The ancient species, despite their pride, were pragmatic. They realized that direct conflict with humanity would only lead to further loss of face and power. Instead, they began seeking new alliances with other factions, quietly offering protection in exchange for political leverage. Their aim was not to crush humanity outright, but to ensure that the human-led movement would not grow any larger, preserving the established order of the galaxy. But it was the Syrah who posed the most immediate threat. Their defeat on Viridia IV had not quelled their hunger for power. Instead, it had fueled an even greater desire for revenge. The Syrah had begun to send emissaries to various sectors of the galaxy, offering military aid and support to rebel factions, especially in the human-controlled colonies. They offered weapons, resources, and guidance to any group willing to destabilize humanity's position. These insurgents, though small in number, began to carry out targeted strikes on human infrastructure, communications arrays, energy stations, and supply lines. The Syrah were biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike with overwhelming force. The human coalition, for all its internal disagreements and external pressures, had not been idle. Keel and his allies recognized the growing threat, and they began to take swift action to secure their borders. The United Human Fleet had expanded rapidly in the wake of their victory over the Syrah. New ships, new technologies, and new tactics were brought into the fold. The human military, no longer disjointed and struggling, now operated as a single cohesive unit. Officers from across the coalition shared intelligence, resources, and strategies. The humans were no longer relying on raw ingenuity alone. They had learned to work together and act as a unified force. Keel's diplomatic efforts, however, were focused on a different front. He sought to strengthen humanity's alliances with neutral or weaker species, those who had been historically ignored or sidelined by the larger powers. The smaller species, many of whom had been mistreated by the Falrak, Zarvan, and Syrah, were beginning to see humanity as a potential ally in the struggle for their own survival. Keel knew that to counterbalance the growing influence of the ancient powers, humanity needed a coalition of its own. His diplomatic efforts bore fruit when several minor species agreed to join the human coalition, providing both military and economic support. But despite these efforts, the threat of outright war loomed large. The galaxy was preparing for a conflict that could spill over into all corners of known space. Ambassador Keel knew that humanity's position, though stronger than ever, was still precarious. The ancient species had more resources, more experience, and greater influence. Humanity's rise, though impressive, was still a work in progress. As Keel sat in his war room, studying the latest intelligence reports, a new message arrived. The Orcs, long considered silent observers, had reached out. Their message was simple: "We understand your position. We will help if needed." The implications of this message were not lost on Keel. The Orcs, whose wisdom and technology were unmatched, had decided to step into the fray. If the Orcs chose to offer their support, it would tilt the balance of power in favor of humanity, but it also painted a target on their backs. The Orcs had never intervened in galactic politics before. If they chose humanity's side, it would be seen as an act of defiance by the ancient species. As Keel prepared for the next phase of diplomacy, he knew that the stakes had never been higher. The galaxy was no longer a place of calm negotiations and political games. It was a battleground, with the future of humanity hanging in the balance. The decision that lay ahead would determine whether humanity would continue to rise, or whether the forces of the old guard would succeed in crushing them before they could truly ascend. The storm had gathered. The first strike had been made. And now, all the galaxy would wait to see how humanity responded. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The galaxy, once a quiet expanse of distant worlds and ancient powers, now teetered on the edge of war. Humanity's rise had sparked an unprecedented shift, and the ancient species were forced to confront a reality they had long avoided. Their time at the top was no longer guaranteed. The Sierra, humiliated by their defeat and desperate to reclaim their lost honor, had begun to move openly. Their secretive support for rebel factions on human-controlled worlds had grown bolder. Insurgencies spread across the coalition's outer territories, attacking strategic military bases and critical infrastructure. The Sierra's strategy was simple: bleed humanity dry with constant skirmishes, sap their resources, and create a sense of chaos that would weaken their unity. All the while, they maintained a facade of distance, pretending to remain uninvolved while their agents stoked the flames of discord. The Thalrak, ever the diplomats, had reached the point of no return. They could no longer ignore the rising tide of human influence. Their quiet alliances with the Zarvan had borne fruit. Together, they were orchestrating a diplomatic and economic blockade aimed at isolating humanity from the smaller, neutral species that had been flocking to their cause. The Thalrak were masters of persuasion, and their influence over the lesser species was undeniable. They presented humanity as a dangerous wild card, too unpredictable to be trusted, and they worked tirelessly to sow distrust. Meanwhile, Ambassador Keel remained resolute. Though the external pressures mounted, he refused to back down. The human coalition had become more than just a political entity. It had become a symbol of hope for many. The smaller species who had once been overlooked now stood proudly by humanity's side. Together, they were a force that could no longer be dismissed as insignificant. As the tension reached its breaking point, the Orcs, whose silence had been their greatest strength, finally made their decision. The message had come through, quiet and deliberate. They would support humanity, but with caution. Their intervention would be subtle, providing guidance and advanced technology to the coalition, but not in a way that would provoke the galaxy's ancient powers into open conflict. The Orcs knew that their involvement could spark a chain reaction that could unravel the fragile peace that still lingered, but they also understood that humanity had become a pivotal force in the galaxy, one that could either stabilize or tear it apart. Their support was not unconditional, and it came with an unspoken warning. Humanity would have to prove it could handle such power responsibly. The Galactic Council was convened once again, but this time, the atmosphere was different. The stakes were no longer just political. This meeting would determine whether the galaxy would descend into war or embrace a new order. Keel stepped into the chamber, his calm demeanor betraying none of the weight of the decisions at hand. The ancient species, now united in their opposition to humanity, sat in silence as the human representative took his place at the podium. Esteemed members of the Galactic Council, Keel began, his voice unwavering. For too long, the galaxy has been ruled by a few, with the fate of many decided by the fewest hands. But no longer. Humanity has stood up against the tyranny of the few, and now we ask for a new path forward, not one of division, but of cooperation. We stand ready to lead, not with force, but with unity. The room was thick with tension. The Syrah, sitting at one end, exchanged glances with the Thalrak, their faces betraying no emotion. The Zarvan, ever calculating, observed the proceedings with quiet deliberation. The Oraki's subtle presence was felt, though no one could truly read their intentions. Keel continued, "You have seen the strength of the human coalition in battle, in diplomacy, and in innovation. But we are not here to dominate. We are here to forge a future where no species, no matter how old or powerful, can dictate the fate of another. The galaxy does not belong to a select few. It belongs to all of us." As his words echoed in the chamber, a deep silence fell over the room. For the first time in centuries, the ancient species of the galaxy had been forced to reconsider their place in the cosmos. They could no longer deny that humanity, with its drive, ingenuity, and unity, had changed the very fabric of galactic politics. But the question remained, would they accept this new reality, or would they resist it with everything they had? The answer would come not from the councils or the diplomats, but from the stars themselves. The final choice had been placed in humanity's hands. The human coalition, bolstered by the support of the Oraki and the smaller species who had rallied to their side, now faced the greatest challenge of all. Could they navigate the fine line between peace and war? Could they prove they were worthy of leading a galaxy that had long been ruled by the old guard? As the meeting drew to a close, the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the final verdict, one that would shape the future of all life in the stars.